if you've been an avid college football watcher since the 1990s up until now, you're going to know Nebraska football for two eras since the 90s. Number one, the mid-90s, where they won 3 national championships under Tom Osborne. But you're also going to remember the other era, which wasn't so nice. That was a few years ago when Nebraska football had hit new lows. As a matter of fact, in 2007, that team went 5-7, did not go to a bowl game, and would fire their athletic director and also fire their head coach, Bill Callahan. They made changes, needless to say, they had to. Enter new AD Tom Osborne, yes, the legendary Nebraska coach, taking over as athletic director. And you also enter Bo Pelini, the former Oklahoma as well as LSU defensive assistant, and yes, he was an assistant at one time at Nebraska. Since 2008, you have to give Pelini a round of applause because he's won 19 games in 2 years. Even though the 2008 defense was dismal, Nebraska made improvement, going from 5 wins to 9. And then 2009 made even more progress by winning 10 games and more notably turning around a defense. It was almost like a 180-degree turn. It was that big, especially trying to run the ball against Big Red. It was very difficult even for the good teams on their schedule to do that. So last year they went 10-4. And of course, we know, came within an eyelash of upsetting Texas for the Big 12 championship and ended the year by absolutely creaming Arizona in the Holiday Bowl. So you take a look at how Nebraska did last year, 10-4, and they have so many ingredients back this season. A lot of people in Lincoln are thinking they should win the North easily and have a pretty good chance of winning the Big 12. And if things fall into place, could Nebraska be in the national championship game? We're going to address these issues coming up. First of all, let's talk about the Nebraska offense, and we're going to talk about Roy Halou Jr. I think he's one of the top 5 running backs in the Big 12. We'll talk about Baron Batch of Texas Tech, Daniel Thomas, Kansas State, DeMarco Murray of Oklahoma, and Kendall Hunter of OSU. But Halou Jr. deserves to be on that list as well. Over 1,100 yards rushing a year ago, and he's back. Very quick back, got speed, had a huge game against Oklahoma last season, and complimenting him is going to be Max Burkhead. Talking about Nebraska, you have to talk about the men up front. Now, these offensive linemen for Nebraska are not the offensive linemen of the 80s and 90s for Nebraska, where they could just absolutely pancake block you whenever they felt like it. It's a good offensive line. I wouldn't call it great, though, but they do return 4 starters, even though the man in the middle, the center, a multi-year starter, he's moved on. So you have 4 starters back as far as the interior goes for Nebraska. The receiving department, the Huskers are not going to be hurting in this area at all. We're talking about Niles Paul. Paul, an explosive receiver, not only utilized as a wideout, but also on kickoff returns as well. Could be the best kick returner in the Big 12. So really watch for him. And also Mike McNeil, who even though is a tight end, he returns and he will be heavily utilized as a receiver. So he's an added weapon for that Nebraska offense. Those are the good things for the Huskers. But we have to talk about the one weakness of Nebraska. We can all say it on 3. 1, 2, 3. Quarterback! Yeah, I had a little drama in there. I have several Nebraska subscribers on this page, and I get feedback from them from time to time. I would love their feedback on the quarterback situation, okay? And I want their personal feeling. Do they think that Zach Lee, who played most snaps last year, can still be the guy for Nebraska, or is it time for a change? Personally, I think Zach Lee's been a disappointment for the Huskers. We heard these good things about him, how well he did in junior college, and then last year, for the most part, he was terrible. If you look at Nebraska's 4 losses last year, they only threw 1 touchdown pass. In fact, Nebraska, as far as pass offense, was the 2nd worst in the Big 12. Only Kansas State was worse than Big Red. So, is it time to give Cody Green another shot? We saw Cody Green a little bit in 2009. Or is it Taylor Martinez? Yes, Taylor Martinez, who I heard did very well in the spring game back in April. But that was the spring game where you know the personnel and you know the defensive alignments, what they run. You see it all the time. So it's going to be an interesting or should I say, three-way decision that Nebraska has to make, because the quarterback position could be the major difference between Nebraska being a 9-win team or winning the Big 12 and maybe bigger and better things down the road. The quarterback issue for Nebraska is that imperative. So we'll see if Nebraska has any improvement at all in quarterback. If they show significant improvement, then they're going to be one of the top teams in the country. Otherwise, they're going to fall short of the goals that they have set out entering 2010. Now, talking about the defense, there's absolutely no way on God's green earth you're going to replace Ndamukong Suh, one of the more dominant defensive tackles I've ever seen. Second overall pick in the NFL draft. His kind does not come around very often. But don't get me wrong, you're still going to have a difficult time moving the ball against that Nebraska front, which will still be one of the best in college football. But Suh, you don't replace him. It's not going to be quite the same line as it was last year. Enter Jared Crick, whom, like Suh, was a first-team All-Big 12 selection last year. But now Crick becomes the anchor of that defensive front. How will he handle being the attention of the scouting reports on the offensive side? Basically, you're going to see him get double-teamed. You're going to see him get a lot of pressure, and that's where I think a guy like Baker Steinkuhler, his other teammate as far as defensive tackles go, that's where he comes into play. Yes, he is the son of Dean Steinkuhler from the 1980s Nebraska teams. Of course, Dean was a legendary All-American up front on the offensive line. His son, though, Baker, plays defensive tackle. And because you have so much hype, and well-deserved hype for Jared Crick, he's going to get a lot of attention. That could lead to single teams for Steinkuhler. It could give him an opportunity to be disruptive in the backfield now that Crick is your main defensive lineman returning. And we cannot leave out Pierre Allen. This is his third year starting up front for the Nebraska Cornhuskers, a fine defensive end. At linebacker returning for Nebraska will be Will Compton, who played last year as a redshirt freshman. Nebraska, by the way, kind of like Kansas State, will line up in a 4-2-5 defensive alignment, really trying to make it difficult for you to pass the ball against them. But one big loss that they have entering this year, even though they return a lot of their defensive players, is going to be the loss of Larry Asante. He was very, very good. The safety is now moved on. But one key player back from Nebraska on the corners is going to be Prince Amukamara, who last year had 5 interceptions and has already earned preseason all Big 12 honors. So you have him returning, and I think as far as the safeties go, we mentioned the void of Larry Asante. Matt Hagg, I think, is going to have an opportunity to fill in. I don't know if he'll be the same type of player, but the good thing about Hagg is that he can play linebacker, or he can be that fifth back, what Nebraska terms as the peso. That's what they call this 4-2-5 alignment. You have to remember that Bo Pelini, tell you what, the Pelini family has pretty good defensive genes, because his brother, Bo's brother, is the defensive coordinator. And I think that defense, when you looked at how bad they were in 2007 and the learning process of 2008, Nebraska's defense, they're trying to get the black shirt term back. Of course, they called them the black shirts in the 80s and 90s. And will this team be similar to those black shirt defenses? Only time's going to tell that. The loss of Suh and Asante are big, but we've learned one thing about Nebraska under the Pelini brothers. These guys can coach and can develop players, and Nebraska will again have a good defense. And finally, number 3, don't believe in your press clippings. Look, this is going to be the first time in a while that Nebraska has entered a season ranked in the top 10. So, naturally, expectations are pretty high. And I know the Texas game later in the year in Lincoln is massive. And I know the game at A&M will be very important. But if you do not beat the University of Washington, then national championship hopes, you can flush them down the toilet. And I know what you're thinking. You're much better than Washington. Should be able to win the game. But remember, it's early in the year. It's your only true non-conference test, because the other 3 games are layups. Washington has an NFL caliber quarterback. He'll probably be the #1 pick in next year's NFL draft if he plays like he did last year, in Jake Locker. going against a team that can throw the ball efficiently and a team that has gotten better under Steve Sarkisian. The game's in Seattle. Naturally, you're going to have to put up with Pac-10 officiating. Take it from an OU fan, it's shady, a.k.a. 2006 versus Oregon. You should win the game, but sometimes these are the type of games when teams ascending can often take for granted, and that's when upsets happen. Naturally, you must prepare like Washington is like Texas or like A&M or like Oklahoma. Washington deserves just as much respect and just as much focus, and it is an early season game. Okay, time to break down the 2010 Nebraska Cornhusker football schedule. If you look at the September home games, all three of them Nebraska should be able to win with their eyes closed. Taking on Western Kentucky, Idaho, and South Dakota State, all at home, 3 victories automatically. Tricky game to watch, though. In the month of September, we documented this on the FYIs for the Huskers. The matchup at Washington, Nebraska should be favored, but you're going against a terrific passing quarterback in Jake Locker, and it is a road game, so I have to go kind of either or in this one, just because the element of surprise cannot be ruled out. Nebraska will get 12 days, though, to get ready for their conference opener, which is in the Little Apple, Manhattan, Kansas, on a Thursday night in early October. But K-State too one-dimensional on offense. Nebraska should win the game. And then all eyes will be on October 16th, ESPN's College Game Day. Just very well may be in Lincoln for that particular matchup between the Longhorns and the Huskers. These two teams on and off the field really don't like each other. And, of course, Texas last year on the final play of the Big 12 Championship edged out the Huskers. Don't think Nebraska hasn't forgotten that. There's going to be a lot of hype, and hopefully the game will meet the hype. I have it going either or. The following week, Nebraska travels to Oklahoma State. Stillwater, not an easy place to win, but Oklahoma State's in the rebuilding stage, and Nebraska too talented, too deep. Huskers should win in Stillwater. And then the following week, hosting Missouri. Last year, Mizzou thought they had Nebraska beat, but Nebraska had a huge fourth quarter and won that game. This time the teams will play in Lincoln. Home field advantage will help the Huskers. I think Nebraska wins this one and beats Mizzou for the second straight year and will have a big advantage in the northern standings. At Iowa State, last year, the Cyclones upset the Huskers, largely in part because of 8 Nebraska turnovers. Don't see that happening again. Nebraska should get the turnovers down big time. Even though it's in Ames, Nebraska will win. And then Kansas, in a bit of a homecoming, as former Nebraska great quarterback Turner Gill, now the head coach of Kansas, comes back to his old hunting grounds. It'll be a little bit sentimental from that perspective, but the game itself looks ugly. Nebraska to roll. And the final road game of the year for Nebraska in the regular season, and it's a toughie, in College Station against the Texas A&M Aggies. Either or in this one, should be a lot of points scored. And the Huskers close out the year, and for the final time, we'll play arch rival Colorado, and it will be a Rocky Mountain low for the Buffs, and the game's in Lincoln. I just don't see any way Colorado can win it. Nebraska should win the game and should win the Northern Division. As you can tell, I have them picked first to win the Big 12 North. Worst case scenario is that Nebraska cannot win those swing games and will go 9-3. And you get the feeling that in Nebraska that would be a disappointment considering everybody they have coming back. Best case scenario, it's not out of the realm of the possibility to think that Nebraska can't run the table. 13-0, best case scenario, and in Glendale for the national championship. That is, if the breaks go right and if they can solve the issue at quarterback. Now, as far as where I think Nebraska is going to finish, as I mentioned earlier, I think they'll win the North, but I don't have them going to the national championship. In fact, I have them losing a close game in the Big 12 championship game against either Oklahoma or Texas. Of course, I'll have my pick on who will win the South later on. 11-2 is a darn good year for Nebraska, but unless the quarterback issue is resolved and resolved big time, I think that's the one thing that's really going to hold Nebraska back from being in the national championship discussion. But still a good year for Nebraska at 11-2, and will have a reasonable shot at an at-large bid for the BCS.